Once upon a time, in a land not so far away, there were many maidens that were enslaved by evil, tight corsets, heavy petticoats, and layer upon layer of restrictive clothing, until one day a hero saved them from their awful clothing and the lifestyles that went with it, so that today... Amelia Bloomer was a little-known but highly influential suffragist who worked to free women not only from their constrictive clothing, but also from their highly restrictive lifestyles. She was tiny and shy and a very unlikely candidate to become a famous suffragist. But she defied the 19th century expectations of women, in which clothing was as restrictive as the laws and customs that made women second-class citizens. Women were not only denied the right to vote, but ridiculed when they tried to stand up for their rights. Many women worked long, hard hours as maids or seamstresses for wages that barely kept them alive. And only a few women had the chance to progress to classrooms like these, including Amelia Bloomer, who only had the most basic education.
For the most part, women remain with a high school education. Men go on to professional schools and colleges. I wouldn't say there are laws against women entering it. They just weren't admitted. Laws that were restrictive are things such as no divorce. Women didn't have guardianship of their children. Women couldn't vote. Married women didn't control their own property. They didn't control their own wages. Once they married, their husbands took that. So there are a lot of laws that do restrict them. But it's mostly habits. It's mostly ways of living that say women are different from men. Women's lives should be different than men's, and women's rules are different than men's.
Amelia Bloomer was the leader of the dress reform movement, which recognized that it wasn't just legal and cultural restrictions that were making women's lives miserable. It was also the clothing they wore. Clothing at that time was completely impractical. Can you imagine having to wear a tight corset, a long skirt, multiple heavy petticoats, and a high collar? It would be difficult to do anything, much less chores and other household duties. The costume of women should be suited to her wants and necessities. It should conduce at once to her health, comfort, and usefulness. While it should also not fail to conduce to her personal adornment, it should make that end of secondary importance. Amelia Bloomer's idea of practical clothing was to shorten the skirt and wear pant-like things, called bloomers naturally, that went down to the bottom of the ankles. Because otherwise, with a hemline like that, trust me, their legs would look like something out of a 50s horror movie.
So you have these cinched-in waists, very tight across the chest, big full skirts. All of that is to emphasize the female body as a maternal body. So you're trying to emphasize a woman's maternal figure, show that she's going to be a good childbearing woman. So you have great differences between men and women, and those differences reflect this ideal that says women are submissive, women are pious, women are domestic. Men, of course, are the opposite of that, ideally. Men are aggressive. Men are independent. Men work outside the home. Now, in reality, men are fathers, women work inside the home, women work outside the home. But the dress becomes more and more distinctive over the 19th century as the ideal says that men and women are different, and not just different, but opposites. So I think the dress reflects that ideal, and it also shapes it, so that the more you articulate the ideal, the more extreme the fashion gets, so that there comes a point where women can barely move because they're overburdened with these huge amounts of clothing. 15 pounds of clothes. Hard to walk around with that. Hard to breathe when you're corseted. So the distinctions in the ideology become reflected in the fashion then begins to shape the ideology.
Amelia Bloomer didn't invent bloomers, but she sure got ridiculed for them, as you can see from these cartoons of the day.
A lot of women are dressing like men in different kinds of professions and in different ways. For the most part, something like the bloomer costume, which is so clearly different from the normative dress that women wore, that becomes an object of ridicule. And because it's associated with reform, because it's particularly associated with women's rights reform, it becomes a topic that men make fun of. Men make fun of the women who wear it, men make fun of the costume, men call the women manly, they're trying to become men and that's why they're dressing like men.
As I wrote in my newspaper, The Lily, we did not suppose until recently that such a little insignificant woman as ourselves could frighten men so easily. Let men be compelled to wear our dress for a while, and we shall hear them advocating for change as loudly as they now condemn it. Some say Amelia Bloomer stopped wearing bloomers because of the conflict they created. She herself says, "It was only because my husband and I moved to a windier location, and the short bloomer skirt kept blowing up over my head." Not very modest. The crinoline hoop skirt soon replaced the bloomer as the height of fashion, which, not surprisingly, were also ridiculed. In some ways, it's really too bad that Amelia Bloomer is known mostly for the bloomer, because she was one of the most amazing suffragists of her time, publishing The Lily, a leading suffragist newspaper, and consorting with other, better-known suffragists.
She became a newspaper editor with her own newspaper. It's called The Lily. It's a beautiful name. And it was a women's newspaper. It was aimed at women. It talked about temperance, talked about reform, talked about women's rights, talked about the condition of women, talked about what liquor did to families, talked about divorce rights, changing divorce rights. And finally, in 1851, women in some states, Massachusetts was one of them, had the right to divorce an intemperate husband, a man who couldn't support her, wasn't supporting her because he was drinking too much. And she becomes well known for the costume because she took Judith Smith Miller's design and published it in The Lily, and it was sent out to all of her subscribers. And pretty soon women from all over America were writing in and saying, "We want the pattern." And it became known as the bloomer costume, although it wasn't. One of her neighbors was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. She was a feminist. Amelia Bloomer introduced her neighbor, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to a young woman named Susan B. Anthony, who was speaking on the circuit about abolition, about women's rights. And the two of them, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, become very close. And as you probably know, they lead the women's suffrage movement for the next 50 years. That's due to Bloomer.
Maybe her greatest contribution really was dress reform, because it begs the question today, are women's roles still defined by the clothing they wear? Are we slaves to the fashion industry and its marketing machine? Do we need to re-examine our roles as purchasers and wearers of fashion? Did we miss an important history lesson here? I wonder what Amelia Bloomer would say. When you find a burden, in belief or apparel, cast it off.